The silver necklace burned against her throat like a brand, and through the library's tall windows the moon watched with ancient eyes as she faced the man who had bought her soul. His confession hung between them like smoke from dying embers, not of love but of centuries-old guilt. Castle walls seemed to lean inward, listening, as if the very stones knew that this moment would either damn them both or set them free. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from the terrible recognition that she had become the mirror he had spent lifetimes trying to avoid. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. Rain fell like the sky was washing an ancient sin. Top the hill, the Varon Manor lit its windows one by one, like eyes awakening to judgment. Inside, the music had ceased suddenly, and everyone turned when the black carriage stopped before the courtyard. The sound of hooves seemed to bring not just a visitor but a sentence. The young woman was delivered in silence, her tight dress betraying the effort to fit the shape the world demanded. Her face, pale beneath the damp veil, reflected more dignity than fear. No gaze lingered on her, only the echo of humiliation that belonged to those sold under the name of family duty. Her name was Leora. She had never been called beautiful. They said she was too large, too slow, too silent. But the gaze she carried, steady, unshakable, disturbed anyone who dared meet it. It was the kind of look that seemed to hold a secret about others, not about herself. The man who waited for her at the door, Lord Varon, did not move when she descended from the carriage. His presence altered the air. The torch flames wavered, and even the wind held its breath. He observed the young woman like one examining a relic from an extinct time, not with desire but with abyssal curiosity. The wedding had been sealed without witnesses, before a priest who trembled more than the candles. The ring, cold and heavy, seemed to bind rather than unite. Leora did not cry. When her name echoed in the empty hall, it seemed each syllable was lost in a space where time dared not enter. The ceremony ended, and the silence that followed was deeper than any prayer. The man, with a voice grave and distant, merely said, "From this night the castle will also be yours. But it demands a price from those who dare remain." The honeymoon was not a night, but a territory. The castle breathed with them, walls that murmured, windows that watched. Leora walked through its corridors like one crossing an imposed dream. And yet, each of her steps seemed to challenge the ground as if affirming, "I am still here." Servants bowed but whispered. They spoke of her, the fat daughter Lord Varon had purchased. They spoke of an ancient promise, of a pact that blood demanded. He watched her in silence. Sometimes from a distance, other times so close that the air between them weighed heavy. He never touched, never smiled. When he spoke, the words came like orders from a time before speech. There was something in his gestures that did not belong to the living, a ceremonial slowness, a calm that wounded. And yet, something in him wavered when she passed. A brief glimmer, almost imperceptible, like the tremor of a candle before the wind. The servants' whispers followed Leora through the endless corridors like ghosts seeking substance. They spoke in fragments, incomplete sentences that painted a picture she was not meant to see. "The master has not aged," one kitchen maid breathed to another as Leora passed the servants' stairs. "My grandmother served here, and her grandmother before her. He looks exactly the same." The words clung to the air like morning mist, heavy with implications that made Leora's skin prickle. Castle itself seemed to pulse with a life that was not quite natural. Tapestries moved without wind, and shadows fell in directions that defied the sun's position. At night she heard footsteps in the halls above her chamber, slow, measured steps that never seemed to reach a destination. When she asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, about the sounds, the older woman's face went pale as winter frost. "There are parts of this house that remember things best forgotten, my lady," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The master walks where he walked centuries ago, following paths that exist in memory rather than stone." Her weathered hands twisted the keys at her belt, a nervous habit that spoke of years spent in service to something beyond her understanding. Leora's chambers were in the east wing, where dawn light struggled through thick curtains that seemed to absorb rather than filter the sun. The room was beautiful in its way, furnished with pieces that belonged to no single era, as if time itself had forgotten its passage here. A vanity table held mirrors that reflected not just her image but seemed to hold echoes of other faces, other women who had looked into them and seen their futures written in silver and shadow. On her fourth night in the castle, Leora discovered the portrait gallery. Paintings lined the walls like silent witnesses, faces emerging from dark backgrounds with eyes that followed her movement. Most were of women, young, beautiful, with expressions that ranged from serene to terrified. The gallery's end hung a massive painting that stopped her breath. It was Lord Varen, but dressed in clothing from centuries past. His face was exactly as it was now, no younger, no older, as if the artist had painted him yesterday rather than in some distant age. Beneath the portrait, a small plaque bore an inscription in Latin that Leora could not read. But she understood the dates, 1623 to 1623. A single year, yet the man in the painting looked exactly like the one who had married her 3 days ago. Her reflection in the portrait's protective glass seemed pale and insubstantial beside the painted figure's eternal presence. When she turned to leave, Lord Varen stood in the gallery's entrance. The moonlight streaming through the tall windows cast him in silver and shadow, making him appear more spectre than man. He moved toward her with that same ceremonial slowness she had noticed before, each step deliberate as a ritual. "You should not be here," he said, but his voice carried no anger, only a deep weariness that seemed to echo from centuries of carrying the same burden. "Why?" Leora's voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. "Because I might see what others have seen? Because I might ask questions that have no comfortable answers?" He stopped 3 paces from her, close enough that she could see the way the moonlight caught in his dark eyes, making them appear almost luminous. "Because some truths are too heavy for mortal shoulders to bear." "Yet here I stand," she replied, lifting her chin with a defiance that surprised them both. "Already bearing whatever truth brought me here." For a moment something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. The mask of cold authority slipped just enough to reveal something achingly human beneath. In that instant, Leora saw not the mysterious lord who had purchased her like property, but a man carrying a burden so ancient and heavy that it had worn grooves in his very soul. The castle around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Even the portraits on the walls appeared to lean forward, as if the painted women were eager to witness this moment of truth between the living and whatever Lord Varen had become. "You wished to know," he said finally, and it was not a question but a statement weighted with centuries of isolation. "Very well. But know that some doors, once open, can never be closed again." The wind rose outside, rattling the tall windows like skeletal fingers against glass. Somewhere in the depths of the castle, a clock chimed midnight, its deep notes reverberating through stone and shadow until they seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. Leora felt the sound in her bones, a vibration that spoke of time measured not in hours or days but in the slow erosion of eternity. "I have lived in this castle for over 4 centuries, Lord Varen began, his voice carrying the weight of each passing year. "Not by choice but by curse. I was young once, mortal once, human once. I loved a woman whose heart belonged to another, and in my jealousy I made a bargain that cost me everything I held dear." The air in the gallery grew colder, and Leora noticed that frost was beginning to form on the windows despite the late summer warmth outside. Portraits on the walls seemed to grow more vivid, their painted eyes following every movement as if awakening to witness the telling of this long-buried truth. "The woman I loved was kind, gentle, everything I thought I desired. But she was also weak, easily frightened, easily controlled. When I used dark arts to bind her to me, she withered like a flower torn from its roots. She died in this very castle, in the room that is now yours, calling not for me but for the man she truly loved." His voice broke slightly on the last words, a crack in the armor he had worn for centuries. Leora felt tears she had not expected gathering in her eyes. Not for her own situation, but for the profound loneliness that radiated from the man before her like cold from winter stone. "And the curse. As she died, she spoke words that bound me to this place, to this existence. I would live forever, she said, but I would never again know love freely given. Every woman who entered this castle would either flee in terror or wither as she had, unable to bear the weight of what I had become. He gestured to the portraits surrounding them. These are they who tried to love me and failed. Some left. Others paid a steeper price. The gallery fell silent except for the whisper of wind through stone and the distant ticking of that ancient clock. Leora studied the painted faces with new understanding, seeing now the story written in their expressions, hope giving way to fear, love curdling into horror, life fading into memory. But I am still here, she said softly, her words carrying a strength that surprised even her. I have not fled and I have not withered. Lord Varen's gaze fixed on her with an intensity that might have burned if she had been any other woman. No, he agreed, and for the first time since her arrival, something like wonder entered his voice. You have not. On the third night, Leora broke protocol. She entered the library, the only room where he forbade the presence of any other being. Books covered the walls like closed wounds. He was there, motionless before the fire, and without needing to turn, he said, I thought you had already understood. Here, nothing is given without cost. She answered only with a look. And for an instant, the castle seemed to lean forward. It was then that he confessed, not from weakness but from exhaustion. They sold you to me believing I sought a wife. I sought absolution. The phrase hung in the air like a prophecy. Leora did not understand immediately, but she felt the weight of the word. He continued, his voice dragging. Centuries ago, someone like you condemned me to eternity. Not for beauty, but for what will not bend. Destiny repeats itself, and I repeat it with you. The fire flickered. The moon, on the other side of the glass, seemed to pulse. She did not retreat. No gesture of hers betrayed fear, only compassion. And in that instant his mask shattered, not in face but in shadow. The great house trembled, the windows opened, and a cold wind crossed the hall as if an ancient presence claimed what was its own. The library's fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and in those shadows Leora saw glimpses of what had been, centuries of solitude, of women who had come and gone like seasons, leaving Lord Varen more isolated with each departure. The books that surrounded them were not merely volumes of knowledge, but repositories of memory, each one a marker of the endless years he had spent seeking answers to questions that had no resolution. I have tried, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Every few decades, hope drives me to seek someone who might break this cycle. I tell myself that this time will be different, that this woman will be strong enough to see past what I have become and find whatever humanity remains. He turned to face her fully, and in the firelight his features appeared both ancient and achingly young. But they always leave. Or worse, they stay and lose themselves in the attempt to love something that perhaps cannot be loved. Leora moved closer to the fire, close enough that she could feel its warmth against her skin. The heat was real, solid, a reminder that despite the supernatural currents that flowed through this place, some things remained grounded in the physical world. What makes you think I am different? 'Cause you ask questions instead of accepting easy answers. 'Cause you walk through these halls as if you belong here, not as if you are visiting. Because when you look at me, you see not a monster or a mysterious lord, but a man carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. His words were quiet, but they carried the weight of centuries of observation, of learning to read human nature with the precision of a scholar studying ancient texts. The fire popped and sparked, sending glowing embers up the chimney like tiny stars seeking the sky. Outside, the wind continued its restless prowling around the castle walls, and somewhere in its voice, Leora thought she could hear the whispers of all those who had walked these halls before her. Show me, she said simply. Lord Varen's eyes widened slightly, as if her words had caught him completely off guard. Show you what? Whatever you think will drive me away. The truth you believe is too terrible to bear. If I am to break this cycle you speak of, I need to see it all, not just the beautiful, mysterious parts but the darkness as well. For a long moment he simply stared at her, and Leora could see the war being fought behind his eyes, hope battling against centuries of disappointment, the desire for connection struggling against the fear of causing more pain. Finally, he extended his hand, palm up, an invitation written in gesture rather than words. When Leora placed her hand in his, she felt the cold shock of skin that had not known warmth for centuries. But beneath that supernatural chill she sensed something else, a pulse, faint but steady, the stubborn beat of a heart that refused to stop despite all reason. The moment their skin touched, the library around them began to change. The books on the walls seemed to open themselves, their pages fluttering as if caught in a wind that existed only in memory. The shadows deepened and took shape, becoming figures that moved through the space like actors in a play being performed for an audience of two. Leora saw them clearly, the women from the portraits, moving through scenes from their lives, their love, their growing fear, their ultimate departure or destruction. She watched as Lord Varen's first love withered away, literally fading like a flower deprived of sun, her beauty becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. She saw others who had tried to reach him, a governess who went mad from the weight of his supernatural presence, a merchant's daughter who fled in the night after seeing him in his true form, a noblewoman who had lasted nearly a year before the isolation and strange happenings drove her to throw herself from the castle's highest tower. Through it all, Leora felt Lord Varen's pain as if it were her own, the desperate hope that accompanied each new arrival, the growing dread as the familiar pattern began to repeat, the crushing despair when yet another soul proved unable to bear the burden of loving something caught between life and death. But she also felt something else, something he might not have recognized in himself, a deep, abiding loneliness that had nothing to do with the supernatural and everything to do with being human. Beneath the curse, beneath the centuries of isolation, beneath the weight of accumulated grief, there was still a man who simply wanted to be known, to be seen, to be loved for what he truly was rather than what others projected onto him. When the visions faded and the library returned to its normal state, Leora found herself still holding his hand. She had not pulled away, had not flinched from the darkness he had shown her. If anything, her grip had tightened, as if she were anchoring him to the present moment, to the possibility that this time might indeed be different. "I see you," she said simply, and those 3 words carried more weight than any elaborate declaration of love could have managed. Lord Varen's composure, maintained through centuries of careful control, finally cracked. His shoulders shook with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, tears that might have been the first he had shed since the night his beloved had cursed him. Leora did not try to comfort him with words or platitudes. Instead, she simply held his hand and let him grieve for all the years he had spent alone, all the connections he had lost, all the hope he had been forced to abandon. Castle around them seemed to respond to this moment of raw emotion. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on every room began to lift, as if the very stones were exhaling a breath they had held for centuries. The windows, which had been clouded and dark, began to clear, allowing moonlight to stream in and bathe the library in silver radiance. When Lord Varen finally raised his head, his eyes were clear for the first time since Leora had met him. The ancient weariness was still there, but it was no longer the only thing she could see in his features. There was also relief and gratitude, and something that might have been the first stirring of genuine hope he had felt in centuries. "You stayed," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I stayed," Leora confirmed. "And I am not withering." The next day, the servants swore they had seen him kneel before her, the man who never bowed. No one knew what she had answered, only that the fire in the fireplace burned for 3 straight days without wood. And when, later, she walked through the corridors, they no longer called her the souled wife, but the Lady of the Moon. The necklace he had given her, made of ancient silver, seemed to pulse beneath her skin, as if it silently guarded the price and power of their own redemption. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it without struggle. There were still nights when the weight of Lord Varen's curse pressed down upon the castle like a physical thing, when the shadows seemed darker and the whispers of the past grew loud enough to drown out the present. But Leora had found her strength in acceptance rather than resistance, in understanding rather than fear. She began to explore the castle more freely, not as a prisoner or an unwelcome guest, but as someone who belonged there. The servants, who had initially watched her with a mixture of pity and anticipation of her inevitable departure, began to look at her with something approaching respect. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, started bringing her tea in the afternoons and sharing stories of the castle's less troubled past. It was different before, the older woman told her one gray afternoon as they sat in the small sitting room adjacent to Leora's chambers. Before the master's condition, castle was alive with music and laughter. There were gardens then, beautiful gardens that bloomed even in winter. The house parties lasted for days, and people came from all over the countryside just to experience the magic of this place. Leora set down her teacup and studied Mrs. Blackwood's weathered face. You remember that time? My grandmother served here then. She used to tell me stories. Mrs. Blackwood's voice trailed off, as if she were seeing those bygone days in the steam rising from her cup. She said the master was different too. Still intense, still powerful, but there was joy in him then. A love of life that made everyone around him feel more alive. What changed him? Leora asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Love, Mrs. Blackwood said simply. Or what he thought was love. The wrong kind of love, the possessive kind that destroys what it claims to cherish. She looked directly at Leora then, her eyes sharp despite her age. But you're different from her, from all the others. You don't try to change him or save him. You just accept him. It was true. Leora had never tried to cure Lord Varen of his curse or convince him to be someone other than what he was. Instead, she had chosen to understand the man beneath the supernatural circumstances, to love not an idealized version of him but the complex reality of who he had become through centuries of pain and isolation. This acceptance began to work changes in the castle that no amount of desperate hope or romantic love had been able to achieve. The gardens that Mrs. Blackwood remembered began to show signs of life, not the riotous blooms of the past, but small, hardy flowers that seemed to draw their strength from the slowly healing foundations of the place itself. Lord Varen, too, began to change. The careful distance he had maintained began to close, not through dramatic gestures or passionate declarations, but through small moments of genuine connection. He began to speak of his past not as a source of shame, but as a series of experiences that had shaped him into who he was now. He showed Leora parts of the castle that had been closed for decades, sharing memories both painful and beautiful with someone who could hear them without flinching away. One evening, as they walked through the portrait gallery where they had first truly spoken, Lord Varen stopped before the painting of his first love. For the first time since Leora had known him, he looked at the woman's face without the weight of crushing guilt. I blamed her for cursing me, he said quietly. But the truth is, I cursed myself long before she spoke those words. I had already chosen possession over love, control over trust. Her curse simply made visible what I had already become. Leora studied the painted face, beautiful, delicate, with eyes that held the terror of someone who had realized too late the true nature of what she had gotten involved with. She was afraid of you. Yes. And she had every right to be. Lord Varen turned away from the portrait to face Leora. I used dark magic to bind her to me, to make her love me whether she wanted to or not. I told myself it was romantic, that I was fighting for our love. But what I was really doing was destroying any possibility of genuine affection between us. And now? Leora asked. He considered the question seriously as he considered all things now, with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take connection for granted. Now I know the difference between wanting to be loved and wanting to love someone well. The first is about taking, about filling a need within yourself. The second is about giving, about helping someone else become more fully themselves. The distinction was not merely philosophical for Lord Varen. It represented centuries of hard-won wisdom, the gradual understanding that true intimacy required vulnerability rather than control, trust rather than possession. With Leora, he was learning to practice this new kind of love, patient, respectful, grounded in reality rather than fantasy. As the weeks passed, the castle continued its slow transformation. Rooms that had been shrouded in dust and shadow began to feel lived in again. The library became a place where they spent long evenings reading to each other, sharing thoughts and observations about the books that lined the walls. The gardens, while still far from their former glory, showed increasing signs of life as spring moved toward summer. But perhaps the most significant change was in Lord Varen himself. The supernatural coldness that had always emanated from him began to warm, not dramatically but gradually, like ice slowly thawing under the influence of persistent sunlight. The servants noticed it first, how his presence no longer made candles flicker or caused animals to flee. The very air around him seemed less charged with otherworldly energy and more simply human. "The curse is lifting," Mrs. Blackwood told Leora one morning as they worked together in the kitchen garden, planting herbs that would actually grow in the gradually normalizing soil. "I can feel it in the stones themselves. This place is remembering how to be a home instead of a prison." Leora looked up from the rosemary she was transplanting, her hands dark with earth that felt rich and alive rather than barren and cursed. "Is that what's happening? Curse is breaking." "I think," Mrs. Blackwood said carefully, "that curses can only exist where there is no real love. Not the desperate, grasping kind that the master felt for his first lady, but the kind that sees clearly and chooses to stay anyway. Kind that doesn't try to change or fix, but simply accepts and cherishes what is." That evening, Leora found Lord Varen in the highest tower of the castle, a room she had never visited before. The circular chamber was lined with windows that offered a view of the entire valley below, and in the center stood an ornate telescope pointed toward the star-filled sky. He was not looking through it when she entered, but simply standing at one of the windows, his silhouette outlined against the night. "I used to come here when the loneliness became unbearable," he said without turning around. "I would look at the stars and try to remember that there was a universe beyond this castle, beyond my own pain. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it only made me feel smaller and more isolated." Leora joined him at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a warmth that would have been impossible when she first arrived. "And now I look at them and think about how they shine even though they're surrounded by vast darkness. How their light travels incredible distances to reach us, and how we can only see them because we're standing in the right place at the right time to receive what they're offering." He finally turned to face her, and in the starlight, his features appeared more human than they ever had before. "I think about how love might work the same way." The metaphor was beautiful, but more than that, it was true. Leora understood now that what had happened between them was not a dramatic breaking of a supernatural curse, but something both more subtle and more profound. The gradual recognition that love, real love, was not about possession or transformation or even salvation. It was about witness, about being present to someone else's truth, about offering your own light across the darkness and trusting that it would be received. As they stood together in the tower, surrounded by the vast night sky and the slowly healing castle below, Leora felt the deep satisfaction of having found her place in the world. Not as someone's salvation or destruction, not as a prize to be won or a problem to be solved, but simply as herself, complex, flawed, human, and enough. The silver necklace at her throat pulsed gently, no longer a symbol of ownership but a token of connection, a reminder that some bonds are forged not in desperation but in the quiet recognition of souls who choose to see each other clearly and love what they find there. Leora, the rejected daughter, had become the mirror the immortal had feared, the reflection of what in him was still human. And the confession under the honeymoon, not of love but of guilt, had left her breathless because for the first time someone saw her whole. Not as she was sold, but as she was born, unsubmissive, inevitable, alive. The story might have ended there, with the curse broken and love triumphant over centuries of isolation and despair. But real love, Leora had learned, was not a destination but a practice, not a solution to life's problems but a way of engaging with them more fully. The months that followed brought their own challenges and discoveries, their own opportunities for growth and deeper understanding. Lord Varen, freed from the supernatural burden that had defined him for so long, had to learn how to be simply human again. There were days when the weight of his accumulated memories threatened to overwhelm him, when the guilt over centuries of mistakes seemed too heavy to bear. But Leora was there to remind him that the past, no matter how painful, was not a prison unless he chose to make it one. "You cannot undo what was done," she told him one afternoon as they worked together to restore the castle's long-neglected rose garden. "But you can choose what to do with the wisdom that pain has given you. You can choose to let it make you more compassionate, more understanding of others who are struggling with their own darkness." They were learning, both of them, how to love without the drama of curses and supernatural obstacles, how to build a life together based on daily choice rather than mystical destiny. It was harder in some ways than the heightened romance of their early days, but also more real, more sustainable, more deeply satisfying. Castle 2 continued to evolve. With the curse lifted, it began to attract visitors again, not the terrified locals who had once crossed themselves when passing the gates, but scholars and artists drawn by the extensive library and the unique beauty of the gradually restored gardens. Lord Varen, once a figure of fear and mystery, became known as an eccentric but generous patron of learning and the arts. But the most significant changes were the quietest ones. The way Lord Varen's laughter, once a rare and startling sound, became a regular feature of their daily life. The way Leora's own confidence grew as she realized that her acceptance had not only freed him but had also freed her to become more fully herself. The way the castle began to feel not like a prison or a refuge but simply like home. 1 year after her arrival, on the anniversary of their strange wedding, they held a real ceremony, not the cold, frightening ritual that had bound them in obligation, but a celebration of choice, of the decision to continue loving each other not because they had to but because they wanted to. The entire household attended, and for the first time in centuries the castle halls rang with genuine joy and laughter. As Leora stood beside Lord Varen, no longer the mysterious and frightening figure who had purchased her, but simply the man she had chosen to love, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been sold as a commodity, treated as an object to be traded for family advantage. But in choosing to see beyond the circumstances of their meeting to the person beneath, she had found not only love but also her own power, her own worth, her own voice. The silver necklace still rested against her throat, but its meaning had transformed completely. Once a symbol of ownership and obligation, it had become a reminder of the choice to stay, to see, to love despite and because of difficulty. Pulsed gently with her heartbeat, a rhythm that spoke not of possession but of connection, not of binding but of freedom freely given. And when visitors to the castle asked about the strange story of Lord Varen and his wife, for stories, even transformed ones, have a way of persisting, they were told not of curses and supernatural romance, but of something more powerful and more mysterious, the simple miracle of two people choosing to see each other clearly and love what they found there. In the end, that was the real magic, the true transformation. Not the breaking of a curse or the triumph over supernatural forces, but the daily decision to practice love as a form of witness, as a way of saying to another person, "You are seen, you are known, you are valued for exactly who you are." The rain that had marked Leora's arrival had long since stopped, but sometimes, on quiet evenings when they sat together in the library or walked through the restored gardens, they could still hear its echo in the walls. Not the sound of the sky washing away an ancient sin, but the gentle rhythm of new life taking root in soil that had learned to nourish rather than merely endure. And if this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes what hurts in us is what makes us most human.